Hey there, guys. Sorry to interrupt the episode, but I just wanted to tell you that I got my real estate license in the state of Rhode Island. So if you need to buy, sell, or need help renting a property in the state of Rhode Island, feel free to reach out. Contact me at maxwellwillett@kw.com or call me at 401-487-4477, and I'd be more than happy to help you. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Knowledge is Power is where you come to hear people's life experiences to learn from. So, without further ado, let's roll the intro.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I have a dream. Will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Hello and welcome back to the Knowledge is Power podcast. This is your host, Max Willett. I'm excited for today's episode because this is the first industry guy we got on the podcast that's in this specific industry. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi there, Max. Yeah, my name is Andrew Roberts. I'm a Visual Effects Supervisor, originally from the UK, living in Los Angeles and working for Industrial Light and Magic.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on. I know you're very busy, and I'm very excited to talk about your career and sort of how you got to this point in your life, especially hearing that you're from all the way across the pond now in California. Must have a pretty interesting life story. So if you could go ahead and basically just tell us your life story, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was born in London in the late 60s. My parents are from the Caribbean. Mum's from Barbados, and my father is from Grenada. And they met in the UK. And I'm one of four children, so raised and educated in London. Early days in the UK, wasn't really too sure what I wanted to do sort of career-wise. I had somewhat of an aptitude for art and a bit of a technical mind as well. So when I was sort of taking my exams, it was a little bit of everything, some computer programming, some design and technology. My mother's a retired nurse, and through that, my first job, I worked at a hospital. It was at the time the largest hospital in London called Guy's Hospital. And I worked there as a medical illustrator. So I would do illustrations for professors' articles. Also got into mainframe computers and learning how to do some basic programming. And through the hospital, they arranged for me to take a degree in computer programming and systems analysis. So I was introduced to sort of the world of computers, and I was building up my knowledge of just communicating that way. I moved on to work at an architect's firm, and so that was when some of the graphics started to come in, where I was learning to be a draftsman, working with graphics-related programs. And it was at that time that I realized that I could do coding and programming, but it didn't come as naturally to me as some of the other guys that were writing code and just bashing it out. And they were, they wrapped up their day at 5 p.m. I was still there 11 o'clock at night, trying to figure out why isn't my code running, and having to just sort of do a lot of debugging. But I found that the graphic stuff I was really into, and using was a program called CADvance, which was one of the early 3D programs, 2D for just sort of drafting out layouts and then figuring out, sort of for office design and layout, how many seats or tables you could fit into a room, and it was all sort of top down. Through my work at that architect's firm, I was hired at Autodesk. And that's when the world of computers really opened up even more to me, because they had AutoCAD, another program called Generic CAD. They had a wide range of programs, and they hired me as a technical, as a quality control, a QC guy. So I was running programs to just test the builds of AutoCAD and some of the other programs. That didn't take up a huge amount of my time. I was available to do other things. And my manager at the time, a lady called Helen Bell, asked me to work with this word processing program and start doing the search and replace, because all of the original documentation would be done in the States, and then that documentation would be sent to the different regions, whether it's the UK or other parts of Asia or Africa. And then each of those local branches would then make adjustments. And so for the UK, I'd put the U back in color and adjust things to British building standards, and then we would release an additional document that then would be shipped out with the software. And I took to that really well. So pretty quickly, I shifted from doing the QC software testing to becoming the technical writer for the UK branch. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed writing. That was something I'd always been into. And so this idea of technical writing and taking complex ideas and translating it into sort of easy to understand, easy to digest and follow along was something that clicked really well with me. And then around the time that Autodesk were releasing AutoCAD Release 11, they wanted to reduce that lag between when US customers would receive their software versus the rest of the world. And so their idea was to take all of the technical writers from all over the world and have us all fly to Sausalito, which is where the head office was at the time, and where we would all receive the instruction and the information at the same time. We each had little workstations. It was sort of little United Nations of writers there in that room. And each of us would localize the documentation simultaneously and then email back the docs for it to be proofread and then printed, bound and printed and sent out. So that was really cool because I got to meet lots of different writers and people from various backgrounds, all at Autodesk's head office. But that was a pivotal sort of branching off point for me because I was introduced to a guy named Gary Yost, and he was the founder of something called the Yost Group. And they had developed a number of 3D programs in the past, and they were working on an early version of what became 3D Studio Max, which is one of the main programs used for animation and graphics. And I got talking with Gary, and he gave me a copy of this program to take back. And he said, hey, just test it and give me your feedback, play with it, see what works, see what doesn't work. And so that began the relationship where I became one of his testers, one of his alpha testers for the software. And so when I got back to Autodesk in the UK, I was really excited about this program because now it's versus the 2D architectural stuff I'd worked with in the past. Now we're seeing these things in 3 dimensions, with shape and volume, and you can sort of move lights around and move cameras around. And that was all new to me in the late 80s, early 90s. And so they allowed me to transition from being a writer to now being a 3D guy, where I would be doing phone support for customers, but then also producing material for marketing material and for trade shows. And I was DJing at the time on the side at the weekends. And so one of my first things was to build a Technics turntable and sort of a nightclub scene. And that got published in one of the magazines. And I was just super excited at this idea of being able to build 3D and have these images that looked realistic. And while I was doing phone support, I ended up talking to someone that worked at one of the largest games companies that was one of the games developers in the UK at the time, called Bits Corporation. And through me supporting some of the artists and then getting to know the owner, they eventually hired me to run the 3D department. And that was quite a shift for me because from being, at Autodesk, sort of being alongside the programmers and understanding, the versions of software they were going to release, and sort of being in that position of knowledge. Now I'm jumping out into the field and saying, okay, I'm going to try being an artist myself, work with people and these sort of really interesting games, 3D games, as we were just branching into 3D at that time, early 90s. And I would say that was the beginning of my life as an artist, where I'm starting to learn about these concepts that I hadn't, because I was a programmer. Now I'm learning about, cinematography and lenses and light and composition. And so it was necessary for me to educate myself, because I technically knew every aspect of this 3D program that I'd been teaching people about. But now sort of, when should you use these things? And what is sort of, the best use of this light or this color or this lens, was something that I sort of had to pick up on and learn, and just be hungry and learn from the other artists and designers and illustrators and animators that were there. I was with that company for a few years, and to say that was really the beginning of my growth as an artist. And one of the guys that worked at that company, Koss, he moved ahead of me to Los Angeles. He was doing some games development, but he was also interested in animation and just sort of multiple media. And he had this proposition for me a couple of years later that he wanted to start this company and would like to have me come over and help him run it. And so my wife and I made that transition from the UK. We relocated to Los Angeles to work with this company, the Design League. It didn't last long. Our backer sort of initially was interested in games, and then he decided to divert off to other things. And so I quickly had to sort of shift from, okay, I'm a company owner, to a roll up the sleeves, get back into working as an artist, and make a living, you know, sort of just provide for my family. And so I just began working at different companies, got to work at a great company, Digital Dimension, where it was sort of those were some of the early films that I had a chance to work on. Final Destination 2, Get Smart, Live Free or Die Hard. And as that company grew, I got to grow as an artist, starting from being a 3D artist, learning how to do compositing. So the 3D side of things is, you know, building models and, you know, sort of then applying texture to it and then figuring out motion and animation. And the compositing is taking those images and then incorporating them, adjusting the color, making sure that it balances correctly with the filmed background plate, you know, removing wires, or if a microphone, a boom mic drops into frame, removing that. So that's the 2D side, the compositing side. And at Digital Dimension, all of the artists had an opportunity to do a number of those things. And from there, I just continued growing and working at different companies in LA. But since that move, in '97, I moved to the States, and it's been my home ever since.
Wow. Very interesting life story. I appreciate you sharing that. So did you mention if you went to college or not?
I did go to college.
Okay.
And it was a place called Lewisham College. At the time, it was called Celtic, Southeast London Technical College. I did a national certificate in computer programming and a higher national certificate in systems analysis. So that's sort of equivalent to a degree.
Yeah. And so obviously your career took a couple of different turns. When you were going to college initially, or when you were in high school, essentially, did you always want to sort of get into VFX in movies and TV, or is that something that just sort of progressed throughout your career?
That progressed throughout my career. When I was at school, there wasn't really much of a VFX industry. I graduated from high school in 1985. So it certainly was a thing out here in Southern California, but it wasn't, you know, certainly wasn't a global industry. There were a few people sort of figuring things out, but it was relatively early. That industry was early, sort of, it was in its infancy in the early to mid 80s. So it really wasn't an option for me, or something I was aware of. So that's why I kind of was I was thinking, do I want to be an architect, or should I do some programming? And then it was a matter of just fully embracing whatever opportunities were presented to me at the time, whether it was the drafting or the programming or, you know, the technical support, and then just sort of going with the flow as things adjusted. And it really was, I would say, when I was at Bits Corporation in London, that games company, that's when I realized, oh man, I can get paid to create graphics. And so that was sort of still more CGI, more computer generated imagery, versus visual effects being where, you know, you're adding elements to filmed footage, loosely speaking. But yeah, it was that sort of realization. I remember I was doing an animation. We had a game, an aliens game, and we were doing this intro where, you know, the aliens dropship was sort of circling around and coming to land on the planet. And I was there late at night, just adjusting some textures and really happy with some of the images that I was producing. And I just remember that moment, like, man, this is so cool. Like, this stuff comes naturally to me. I'm loving what I'm seeing, and I'm getting paid to do this. So it was around then that I realized, oh, this is what I want to continue doing for the rest of my career.
Yeah. And where do you sort of like draw your creativity from? And do you feel like that was the initial point where you sort of discovered it, or is it something that you continually like sort of draw from throughout your career, if you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, my father was a carpenter, and he introduced concepts of design to me and my siblings, my brothers and my sister. And we've sort of taken that in various ways, where my sister used to design clothes, and my one brother designs houses, and another teaches robotics at London University. But we're all able to trace that seed of design and creativity to those early days when Dad might be just sort of sketching something on a piece of paper. And that idea of having a concept and then making it was something that we saw him build a house in the Caribbean. And he would make various things, if it was a go-kart or a kite. So I think that was the seed of creativity, where just that was something that was in our family and in our lives from quite young. But where I continue to get that from has always been, and I would say, from me realizing that I had a very strong technical grounding, but I didn't have so much creative. I sort of felt at a disadvantage because I didn't go to art school. And a lot of the artists I was around, I just felt like, wow, they've got all this knowledge I didn't. And so because of that feeling of inadequacy, I was constantly buying magazines, Cinefex magazine, Cinefantastique were two that were out at the time, that would constantly talk about film techniques, art techniques, lots of art books. Because this sort of then was really pre-internet, or the early days of the internet, where constantly going to bookshops, and just whether it was, learning about sculptors or painters and various artists, and then case studies in magazines like Cinefex, that would also be sort of something that would spur me on and help me understand how people were getting things done. One other thing that I would point to, which was like an annual source of inspiration and creativity for me, is an annual conference called SIGGRAPH. It's a special interest group in computer graphics. And that's been going on since the 80s. My first opportunity to attend SIGGRAPH was in 1993. And it's just everyone that's involved in anything to do with graphics, visual effects, CGI, animation, stop motion. They would all meet for a week and talk about techniques. They would release papers, release research. And then there would be this thing called the electronic theater, where everyone would submit their work, or have the opportunity to submit their work, whether it was, a studio or some students or some researchers. And there would be a panel that would select the best work of the year. And those pieces then would get displayed for a 3-hour presentation called the Electronic Theatre. And each year I would sort of make an effort to go, and I would just see this amazing work, stuff that I'd never even sort of dreamed of, and some beautiful work, say from students out of French colleges, or researchers in Tokyo, to say all over the world. There'd be some really beautiful work, along with, of course, studios and commercials. And I always found that to be a huge boost, where I'd be like, man, let me try that, or I wonder how they did that. And that would get me really excited, sort of going there and seeing. Initially, you'd go there in person to actually experience it. But then as you started to get into the late 90s and the 2000s, then a lot more of that was available online. But that was a great source of inspiration and creativity for me. And nowadays, you've got YouTube. There are various websites like ArtStation. There are lots of podcasts where people talk about creativity and different techniques that they're using. And so there's a lot more that you can sort of pull from today to just sort of keep yourself hungry and curious about what the next technique should be, or how to make things look beautiful or real.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you sort of brushed over this a little bit ago. Can you explain the difference between VFX and CGI? Because somebody like me, I sort of look at it as the same thing, and hearing what you said earlier, that seems like the wrong thing to think.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Great question. And in fact, I'll take it one step further. Often people will talk about this stuff they see on screen, and sometimes they'll use the word special effects. And special effects, or SFX, the abbreviation, that relates to stuff that will be filmed, captured on the day in camera. So you think of a controlled explosion, or animatronics, some puppeteering, some prosthetics. Maybe if someone's releasing smoke and mist into an environment, and that is filmed along with the actors being there and people interacting with it, that's special effects. And there will be a special effects supervisor who makes sure that that's done safely and matches the director's needs. So that is filmed on the day. Then when you're talking about visual effects, VFX, that is material that's work that's done post-production. So after, generally speaking, there's sort of an exception to that I'll mention in a second, but generally speaking, visual effects will be after the production is wrapped, they finished filming, they figured out which shots they like, and they will send it to a company to say, okay, we need a dragon here, we need a castle there, we put a green screen up behind this guy, and we need you to remove, that green screen and make him look like he's in this other environment. That's all visual effects, which happens post-production after the main production. Then the other term I mentioned, CGI, computer-generated imagery. If you think of something like Pixar, or Shrek, where there's nothing that's filmed, but everything is created. The environment, the characters, their interactions, the effects in Encanto, all of that has been designed and planned out. And all of that then gets built, modeled, animated, textured, and then rendered and then edited together. And so that is CGI, where all of the imagery is done by artists using a computer. Does that sort of help? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And yeah, just because, I consider myself a fan of movies. I enjoy, who doesn't enjoy watching movies? It does, when it comes to Star Wars, I would consider myself a nerd. If there's different tiers 1 through 5, I'd say I'm probably like a 2 to a 3, you know what I mean? I don't know everything, but I enjoy it, I think, more than the average person does. But what's funny is my cousin Jimmy, I remember when I was a little kid, sent me an autographed picture of Darth Maul with Ray Park's signature on it, and I still got that hanging on my wall. Yeah. Pretty sweet.
That's awesome. So let me just, so that one other thing I was going to mention is, so I'd mentioned that, you've got in-camera special effects, and then visual effects happens after things are filmed. If you've seen The Mandalorian or The Book of Boba Fett, I'm not sure if you've heard of the term stagecraft or virtual production.
I actually just wrote that down. I was going to ask you a specific question about the system that they were using.
Right. And so what that is you're filming, you've got characters in this space on a stage, and there's imagery that's been created prior to the day that you're shooting. It's all planned, everyone works together on it. And these stages are known as the volume, because it's a huge stage that is, the walls are made up of LED screens, the walls and the ceiling. And then that 3D imagery that has been created, along with the filmmakers, is then projected on the walls. And so now you've got that combination of, you're filming characters, you're getting characters in camera on the day, but then the footage that you're seeing behind them is computer generated material, and you're capturing it all together. And so the technology that ILM, there are a number of companies that have virtual production solutions. The one that was innovated for Mandalorian and other shows is called Stagecraft. And that's a complex kind of combination of, you've got these walls with this footage, it tracks where the camera is. So it's not just like 2D footage playing back, it's actually a 3D environment using a 3D engine, a real-time engine, so that if I have my camera on a track and you're at the other end of the hallway and I'm pushing towards you, if you were really doing that in a 3D space, there would be an adjustment in perspective, And as you move past certain objects, you start to see from the front. Now you're seeing the side or the edge of them. Because this is a 3D environment that's created, and this technology also tracks where your camera is, where you're looking from, it knows the correct perspective to draw on the walls. So you can move left to right, up and down, and the perspective on the walls will move correctly. So as you're looking through the camera, it really looks like that person is there. One of the huge benefits of that is that if you think about sort of traditional green screen, that chroma green, that very bright green, is a color that computers are easily able to identify and remove, so that then you can put something back behind them. And that's still the way that most things are done. But if you think about, say, like the helmet that Mandalorian wears, where it's, you know, very reflective, in a volume, now you've got this content on the ceiling, you know, on the walls. Now you're getting all of these reflections that just work automatically. One of the fallbacks of green screen is that, okay, I'm on a stage, and I sort of say, okay, well, this is supposed to be daylight. You're supposed to be in a desert, so let's kind of have some warm light from over here, and we'll put some green behind you, and we'll figure it out later. You know, we'll do the best that we can to sort of work you into that environment and make it look like you're there. But it's not the same as putting sand on the floor and then having this content on the walls where you've got, you know, the warm sand, and then you've got the blue sky, and this whole volume is illuminating you. So separate from what's behind you, this volume is an amazing lighting tool, where the light, the dappled light, if you're in a forest, and so we've actually got trees that are stretching up and the sunlight sort of peeking through the trees, that you just get those shadows of the leaves as you're moving around. So that it really just looks like you're there, because so much is about lighting on the character, not just, you know, what's behind the person. And so that's virtual production, and that's becoming more affordable as LED screens are cheaper, and you know, these things are springing up all over the place. And ILM have used that for a number of films, for the latest Batman movie, The Midnight Sky, as well as a number of the shows that you may have seen on Disney Plus, like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Mandalorian. So it's allowing you to travel to different places and realistically have the characters look like they're there without having to move from that stage.
So usually I don't have like this is a video podcast, but I think just for viewers that are watching it, I think I'm going to play sort of the footage that's available on YouTube of those screens, because I have seen that on YouTube before, and it's amazing. It's literally just a giant screen with the background. And the way I think about it is, there's an aquarium near where I live, and they have a sort of a ride at this aquarium, and it's sort of theater. It's a theater seating, and you got a big screen, but the seating is on this platform that moves, right? And then the screen will sort of move with you, and it'll change perspectives, and you watch like this whale and this giant squid fight or whatever, right? And you sort of move with the screen. Like how I think that system works for people that you know, haven't seen it and are listening to the podcast. It's at the Mystic Aquarium in Connecticut, and you think, all right, the camera is you in this scenario when you're shooting Mandalorian, and the screen is a screen, and it sort of changes perspective as you move, if that makes sense. I don't know. That's sort of, I think about it. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I think that's a good analogy. Yeah, that's a good example where that technology is, it's based on your viewing angle and what you're doing. And content changes. If anyone's ever been to the Soaring Over California, there's a ride where it's a similar thing, where you're in a chair, and it will tilt and rotate. And it's predefined because there's been sort of this footage flying over different parts of California. And so as the camera dips, the seat will sort of dip forward a couple of degrees. And it's enough to trick the brain sort of with that movement, and your body and brain sort of just the sensors in your ears feeling that you're tipping forward, and then actually seeing the footage adjust is enough to really sort of convince you, wow, I'm on this ride. I was fortunate enough when I was working at Pixomondo, I was a visual effects supervisor there. That's another company here in LA. And we had a ride for a client in China. where we were flying over this province called Hubei province. And so we got a chance to travel to all of these different locations. We had a drone team where we captured all of the data from different angles. And then we created this flight through these different regions. And so we spent a year working on the graphics for those different locations. And then we came back and then we installed it at the theater, where we were programming the number of degrees that the seat, the 6 degrees of freedom seat would move. And it was just amazing just getting to test that out. And for content that I'd spent, years just, or months, I should say, looking at just on a screen, now when it's this wraparound 160-degree environment and the seat is changing, it really does just trick.
Hey there, listeners. Thanks for stopping by to the podcast today. Please, before you're done listening to this episode, leave us a review. If you're on Spotify, you can review now, and you can also review on Apple Podcasts. But if there's any platforms that I'm forgetting about and you can leave us a review, please do so. If you're happening to watch this on YouTube, and if you don't know, you can watch these podcasts on YouTube now, please like and subscribe to the channel and share the episode as well. So thanks for stopping by, everybody, and enjoy the episode.
Your brain where you feel like, wow, I'm actually in this world. So the stagecraft system is similar to that in that you've got content that is changing based on what your camera does.
Absolutely. So were you on set when they were filming with that equipment? Were you there seeing those giant screens in person?
Yes. So for Obi-Wan Kenobi, I was there as the brain bar supervisor, and then also as I supported the Virtual Production Supervisor. I was the second unit supervisor. So working with the filmmakers and making sure that those environments and that content looks as real as it can be. And it is a really great collaborative process between the guys that are building the environment and the production designer and the artists who sort of know what the director wants it to look like. So we would go through multiple tests and a pre-light process where we make sure that it looks right on the screen before we shoot, so that on the day we're there. But yes, I would be at the volume at Manhattan Beach Studios. We would load the content up, pull it up on the walls, and then the team called the Brain Bar is 5 artists who were working in real time. They're working on the real-time engine, so that if the director says, okay, you know what, can we change the sky, or can we move the sun over there? Those hills over there, they look a little bright, because it's a real-time engine. With the proprietary system ILM has, our artists are able to go in and make those adjustments so that, okay, yeah, is that bright enough? Do you want it a little bit darker? And there's also another artist who has an iPad that's connected wirelessly remotely to that system, so that if we're there in the volume and now, the cinematographer, the director of photography says, okay, I'm getting too much light on this guy here. Is there anything you can do about that? Then they can create like a black flag, the sort of a digital equivalent to sort of something to create a shadow or a screen. And then they can just sort of place that up on the wall to block out some of the light. And so you're able to, in real time, start to shape the light on the actors and adjust, okay, we want it a little bit brighter, a bit warmer from overhead. And they're able to move lights around or move objects around so that the environment you see behind them, as well as the way that they're personally lit, is really controlled. So they've got the ultimate real-time control on the day.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to talk about like the combination of VFX and CGI, because that's a thing, right? Like one of my most favorite movies that has came out recently is the new Dune adaptation of the book by Frank Herbert. I watched the first part of that movie, and then I went and read the book, and I fell in love with it, and I can't wait for the new one to come out in November. And I remember there's a scene in the movie where I don't know, I'm going to get technical, but I guess not. The bad guys are coming after the good guys, and the good guys are running after to get in like one of their ships. And you can see the ship sort of blow up, and it looks practical. Like, I don't know if it's CGI or not. I don't know if you've seen the movie.
Right.
So you know when Josh Brolin is running after they're getting attacked to their ships, and it blows up right in front of them. Do you think that scene was completely CGI, or did they have like sort of a small model that they had like a controlled explosion or something like that? Because it looks so real. Or do you think that's purely CGI?
Right. Yeah. So I think you're talking about the raid that happens at night, right? Like
Yeah, at night. It's when the
yes.
Harkonnens attack the Atreides. I didn't want to get too technical because people will get bored about that stuff, but I love it. So
yeah, beautiful work. And
yeah,
I remember seeing that at a screening and just being really impressed at the level of design that went into that. I believe that those explosions were computer generated.
Yeah.
And my guess would be that, of course, Josh Brolin and the rest of the guys that were running towards their ship, hoping to take off, that's a plate that was filmed in the foreground, and then that terrain was extended, and then obviously the ships were all CGI. It's possible sometimes there will be elements that are shot that are filmed, just because there's sort of so much realism in a real explosion and intricacies in that often, a lot of filmmakers prefer to shoot an explosion, and then even if they enhance it with additional VFX and additional digital pyrotechnics, the heart of it is something that's real. I feel like and I should go back and look at that to be sure, but my gut tells me that the majority of that was digital. That was digital pyro. It could have been enhanced. There could have been some other elements that they used, because online there are lots of elements that you can purchase, or as I say, the filmmaker may have filmed some elements that they incorporated into it. And I know, thinking about the breakdowns for Dune that I saw around the time, that they try to be as practical as possible. Even when are they called the ornithopter? The
thopters. They call them. I think they call them thopters in the movie.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of those elements were originally filmed with a helicopter, and then they were so that you've got the correct sort of dust interaction. And there was sort of a lot of realism with something landing, and then they would remove that and put the digital craft in there. There are other things like where they actually had a physical buck that the characters would be in, and they had the sand screen that surrounded them, and they were filming them, sort of that thing would move around as they were sort of piloting, and then they would take that footage and then now place it in the sky. But a lot of it was practical, and so it is entirely possible that they used some real elements. But of course, there was a lot of digital a lot of digital enhancement, like where those bombs would be pushing and trying to force
to the
their
shields
way through the force field. Worth looking up. I'm curious to do a YouTube search on that to see if there's some behind the scenes on that attack.
That's by far, like, of the past couple of years, that's my favorite movie, and like I said, I'm dying to see that second part come out. So something else something that you've worked on that has the combination of VFX and CGI, my mind goes to the scenes in Mandalorian season 1. Did you work on Mandalorian season 1?
I did not, no.
Okay.
Right. My first ILM production, sort of a stagecraft production, was Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'm trying to think. So I don't know. Can you come up with an example in the show where you sort of combined it? Because I think that's pretty interesting, because it's not only during the production, but then you're also having to combine post-production as well.
Right. Yeah. So a number of the shots that were filmed on the volume, they would have been in-camera finals. Maybe a little bit of color correction afterwards, but if you've got Ewan McGregor in the foreground, and then in the background you're seeing him work at that whale farm where they were carving up meat, and the whale meat, that a lot of those, because the background looked great, it had already been designed, and there were digital people walking around in the background, and sort of things moving around, that shot was just done. They were happy with them. But then there were other scenes, like I hope there are no spoilers here.
Spoiler alert. Yeah.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. The ending battle between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, where they're going against each other. So that was filmed in the volume, and there was somewhat of a location where there were it was that rocky terrain.
Yeah.
And that was all captured in camera. But then afterwards, there were when Obi-Wan uses his powers to bury Darth with all the rocks. So those were added digitally afterwards. There was additional enhancement with like other atmosphere and smoke, and I think there were other little details that the director, Deborah Chow, wanted to get in there. At the end, she's like, oh, that area looks a little bit barren, so let's add something there and there. But that would be a good example where we filmed the characters, had somewhat of a background, which was in the volume, but then afterwards, the rocks and all of the effects that were part of the battle, those were added in post.
So when it comes to those effects, right, did you guys have any say in the terrain that they were fighting in, or was it already written into the script where they would sort of be and what sort of terrain it was, or did you guys get creative freedom on that?
It's a mixture. It's really a collaborative process, where the director and then the visual effects supervisor and then a production designer and the art director and that whole team are all working together. It's mostly going to come from the director, where, okay, she knows the action and she knows what she wants to happen. And then she's working closely with people like Doug Chang, who did a lot of the art and the production design for that. And I'm forgetting Todd's last name, but there was another production designer that they worked together to figure out the look. But what we did, and the way that ILM works, is they will have these virtual art department meetings. And that's another aspect of virtual production. It's not just being in the volume, but they're using computer technology prior to that. So that, okay, first you've got the written word, and then you've got, concept art and sketches. And then pretty quickly, artists will build, a 3D version of that in Unreal Engine. That then the director and the art director and everyone, they'll put on their goggles and they will actually do a virtual art department scout where they're in the environment looking around. And they'll say, okay, can we move that over here? And, we need some more rocks there. And as part of that process, the art team will be like, okay, we'd recommend this. Let's have less of that. And so our recommendations are incorporated into it, where it's really a collaborative process where, if she said, okay, I want, like 2,000 people, parascending out of the sky at this point. And if it's just not technically possible or realistic or within the time constraints and budget, then that's an opportunity for the visual effects supervisor and the team to say, you know what, we can give you 4 guys, and we can do this and that, and just work together as a team to figure out, what would be the most appropriate way. So yes, it is a collaboration where our input and our feedback is taken into consideration. And then even once, so they say what they want, and then we're taking her requirements and then building that environment. Once that note is given to an artist, the artist who's actually building it, then they still have quite a bit of freedom themselves to be like, okay, these are the parameters I've been given. I know that it's this barren moon, and I know that it's supposed to look like this. This research that I've done on the side, I've seen this lava rock and it's got some very interesting structure, and I'd like to incorporate some of that. So sometimes you might present the version that's been requested, but then give them an alt to be like, I was trying this other stuff and I'm really excited by this look. And so with, ILM being a very open place where they encourage artists to get involved and to, put their creative ideas forward, there's a lot of opportunity for artists to do that and actually, give their take on what's being requested. Because if you and I could see a phrase, elephant on a bike, and if we were to both draw that, it's going to look completely different, right?
Mine would definitely be the worst.
And so there are so many ways of interpreting, like any given sort of direction. And so even with some pretty clear direction or specific direction, there's still some latitude for artists to put themselves into the work, which is also pretty rewarding.
So yeah, all right. So I got a good idea here, and you let me know what you think about this. So I'm looking at some of the productions that you've worked on, and I'm gonna ask you the series or the movie and sort of your favorite scene that you worked on in the movie. Is that okay?
All right. Yeah.
All right. So let's just start off with Obi-Wan, the Obi-Wan series. What was your favorite scene that you got to work on in that series?
Favorite scene is where the Jedi Temple is getting stormed, and there's the storming of the Jedi Temple. It's an open, and then you have the younglings who are being defended by one of the Jedi Masters. And that was a beautiful combination of pretty complex camera work on the volume. So there was an additional corridor that was built on to the mouth of the volume, so that we had the Steadicam operator moving backwards as stormtroopers and various people were coming in and attacking. And then we had an amazing stunt woman who was, parrying and jumping around and sort of fending off the blasters. And so then he sort of panned around and followed her in. And, you had squibs going off, and there was sort of lots of special effects on the day. And then she gets shot and she crumples to the ground, and then the younglings surround her. One of them says, what should we do? And then one of them says, we run. Now, as they were talking, the Steadicam operator then attached, so he was walking with the camera and capturing all of this action, and then he attached the camera to a crane during the conversation, so that as the kids got up and then started to run down the pathway, that now this crane seamlessly moves up, and this is all one continuous shot. So it booms up high as they're running off. And so just working with the team and figuring out, okay, what do we need our 3D environment to do? And how do we accommodate capturing all of this movement? It was a complex day. It was exciting. It was a lot of fun to be there during the filming of that. And then moving into post-production, where we just added layers of, sort of various Jedi fighting off the invasion on different levels. That was added in post. And then also the younglings, they were running along this little corridor, but the volume only lasts a certain distance. And so then we had to hand off to a group of digital actors that continued the run up the pathway. So that was very, very rewarding to see, from filming on the day to what it ended up with and all the additional layers. I would say that was definitely up there for me.
All right. Yeah, cool. So the next movie there's a lot of great ones in here, but I think just for the sake of time, I want to pick ones that are, I don't know. This is kind of selfish, that I find interesting.
Sure.
But I'm looking at all these, and it's very, very amazing resume here. You know what? I'm going to ask that, there's obviously some other ones in here, but Gemini Man was something that was interesting because you had a whole character in there that was de-aged, right? So could you explain sort of, I don't know, your favorite scene that you got to work on in that, and maybe that process? That would be pretty interesting too.
Yeah, so with Gemini Man, I was working at a company called Scanline Visual Effects, and all of the digital, so they did an amazing young Will. There were sort of 3 versions of, right? There was Will Smith, and then there was the younger one, and there was the youngest one, right? All of that work was done at another facility at Weta. Scanline is a company, they were really intrigued by what Ang Lee was trying to do, because it was stereo, it was high frame rate, and then it was very high resolution. If I recall, it was like 8K, 60 frames a second in stereo. So the work that we did, that Scanline did, there is a shot where there's a sequence where Will Smith is hiding inside a liquor store, and the guys pull up, and they've got a rail gun, and they just sort of tear that thing apart. And I don't know if you remember that scene, and they're sort of hiding, and then the bullets are just sort of like just completely decimating.
Is that towards the end of the movie?
It's towards the end, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I've seen it a couple of times, but yeah, I think I remember that scene.
And so we had to recreate this this digital liquor store, and so all of the shelves, the visual effects supervisor was very specific about the rounds that were being used and the speed that they traveled, and based on the camera it was being filmed with, sort of what the motion blur should look like, and just having sort of all of that chaos of all of the bullets ricocheting. It was a really complicated sequence just to completely destroy that. I mean, we had bottles of wine and spirits that we had to build digitally, and so the liquid is flying out as these bottles are shattering, and just sort of atomized glass and rum and so on. And so there were a bunch of sequences that we worked on for that movie scattered around, but that was sort of like the concentrated effort was really for that, the gun tearing that apart. So that was a film that I would say the majority of the work, I mean, all of that amazing digital character work was actually handled by another facility. But yeah, the tearing apart of the liquor store and all of the work we did on that was heavy lifting, just because systems aren't really designed to be working at 60 frames a second, 8K stereo. So it was sort of like a technical challenge as well as sort of creatively making it interesting and exciting.
All right, cool. So the next one that sticks out is I've been just scrolling through here, and you got to work on Avatar.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Very fortunate.
The original Avatar.
The original Avatar,
Yeah.
yes. And I was at a company called Prime Focus. And again, I was at a vendor that got to work on like a smaller section. So I didn't get to work on the Na'vi or any of those characters. But the sequence we worked on is the first time when the military, they decide that they're going to go and start attacking what's the name of the tree?
The life tree or something like that.
Right, yeah. And so you have this scene, there's a number of shots where sort of all of the crafts are taking off and peeling off and heading off in that direction, and the camera's panning left to right, and you're sort of seeing military move around and various craft fly over as it's this leaving for battle scene. And ILM and a bunch of other vendors were working on that. But at Prime Focus, we were using 3D Studio Max, 3ds Max for that, and their tool set was more Maya based, and so there was a lot of work converting the assets from Maya to 3ds Max, and then making sure visually that everything looked the same, and then texturing these craft, having the characters, have all of the detail, applying motion capture to the people that were running across the tarmac. So that was a lot of fun, just working on this really complex, dense scene with lots of aircraft and lots of people and Atmo and all of that.
Very cool. All right. So the next one, I know this is sort of corny, but I'm going to ask this one for my mom because I know she loves this movie, and that is Elf.
Yes.
So what did you do on Elf?
So Elf, I was at Digital Dimension back then, and that was, I mentioned that back then artists had to do a number of things, and because as sort of films got more complex, you start to get a bit more broken down into, okay, are you an animator, or are you an effects artist, or do you just model? But back then at this company that we were at, we did a little bit of everything. So for Elf, I got to track shots, so figuring out what the camera was doing in order to add additional things into the shot, and then do animation and then compositing. So scenes where Will Ferrell he's getting pelted with snowballs, or
I remember that snow scene. Yeah,
all the digital snowballs. All those scenes.
And then he throws it really fast.
Exactly, yeah. And so those were all animated, and we got to sort of track those shots, add the snowballs, and to make sure the impacts looked good with sort of with the breaking snow. So it was all those scenes.
Cool. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And I want to ask you, so what were your favorite projects that you got to work on throughout your career?
That's a good question. Let's see. I should scroll through and have a look at let's see. My favorite. I really enjoyed Get Smart, I would say. So that was from 2008. And that was, there was some shots that we did. Digital Dimension did quite a lot of work on that. And there was this Cessna where they were sort of trying to get to the Opera House to foil some, I forget the details of, the guys they've got to get, to this place in time. And they're in this, this small plane. And it was a lot of fun just figuring out, okay, how do we make this plane's movements realistic? And we were working with some tools that allowed you to use a game controller to sort of fly the plane, and you could, sort of be affected by, sort of wind patterns and that kind of stuff. So that allowed us to set the animation for the plane, but then taking it to that level of, okay, let's, capture what was the environment like, what should the sky look like, how can we get this thing as detailed as possible. I mean, this plane was modeled down to the rivets, and the metal panels that it would be constructed from, in order for the lights, as the light passed over the surface, for, specular highlights to break up realistically. And so that was, I would say, sort of one of the first movies where we were really trying to get as close to photorealism as possible, or what was possible for us at the time. And that stuff turned out, it turned out really great. So that was one that was really, really rewarding. A movie that was sort of just out there, kind of crazy in some of the action, but was a lot of fun, was Fast Five.
Oh, okay.
And that was set in Brazil, and there was a scene now where Dom and his guys are dragging a safe behind their Dodge Challenger, and they're going across this bridge towards Rio. And there was a combination of, there were a couple of safes that they actually built on wheels, so that they could actually film them on set. And there was another safe that could sort of like withstand some tumbling. But so for the ones with wheels, where it would be sort of, filmed with the car dragging it, then we had to drop those down to the ground and add sparks in order to really, sort of get convincingly add that friction. But then there's a pretty crazy scene where, sort of like he turns the car into a spin and causes the safe to tumble and take out the bad guys. And so a lot of it was sort of over the top in terms of the action, but it was a lot of fun just working with these, these photorealistic vehicles and trying to get this safe to look as realistic as possible. And to say, like Fast Five, or the Fast series, has got more and more ambitious and fantastic each version. But that was a really good one for just sort of crazy fun.
Cool.
Snow White and the Huntsman, we worked on the intro for that. And so that was where there's this army that is sort of, the knights shatter, and they're sort of all made of obsidian. And that was good just for sort of getting into complex particle systems and dynamics. And, you really need to sort of get the technical founding, but at the end of the day, it's got to look right, And so on top of the shattering and the fragmentation is then, getting the correct lighting and depth of field, and just making sure that that these images look as good as all the other frames that were shot. So I'd point to that one as a fun one too.
Yeah. Another question I have for you: were there any actors that showed like a specific interest in what you were doing, or sort of like hovered over your shoulder and asked questions? Or I know that you guys are sort of separated and might not be in the same place at the same time, but was there anybody in particular, like when you were on set, that would ask you like, hey, how are you going to do this? What are you going to do to that? Was there anybody in particular that sticks out?
Not really. As you say,
No.
They normally sort of keep, and again, just in terms of traditionally the time where, actors, they spend their 3 to 5 months on set, and then they're off to their next thing, and then sort of the VFX vendors pick up later. But even on set, they usually really focused on their character, their lines, and often as a VFX supervisor or an on-set guy, you've just got so much that you're trying to be prepared for. Planning in terms of measurements, and do we have that information? What lens are they using? Trying to capture as much information as possible so that when the team starts working, they've got all the information that they need to get a job done. So yeah, I haven't had too many interactions, a couple here or there, but nothing to the extent where nothing major, because as I say, we're sort of, everyone's focused on just their job and just trying to get it done.
Absolutely. Have you ever been on a set of a movie or TV show where you were just sort of like blown away that you were there able to work on this production? What movie comes to mind, or TV show?
Yes. Well, there's a show that it's not released yet, so maybe we'll have a follow-up later this year.
Is it an ILM? Is it a Disney property show?
It's a show that ILM is working on.
Okay.
And there were times where I was just like pinch myself. I can't actually believe I'm here.
So you can't even say what the title is?
No. But yeah, so but I did get a chance to support. I was working alongside John Knoll. They were doing reshoots for Jurassic Dominion. And this was for some of the interior scenes in the lab when things are starting to kind of go sideways. And they just needed to pick up some additional dialogue just to sort of fill in for the film. But getting to work with closer with John Knoll, who's an absolute legend in, created Photoshop and is one of the innovators, just in terms of visual effects in general. If you ever get a chance, or your audience gets a chance to watch the Light and Magic documentary on Disney Plus, that talks about the inception of industrial light and magic, sort of how George Lucas started off with Star Wars and the subsequent movies, and the shift from practical effects to visual effects when computers started to become more in use. And John is featured in that. So he's there are lots of legends of visual effects, but John is definitely one that I look up to. And so he needed some additional support for a couple of days while they were doing reshoots. And I was like, yep, I'm in, was able to, to sort of like hear more about his background and life story. So that was sort of like not so much for that. I mean, the film was great. It was good to be there to help, finish those scenes for Jurassic. But for me personally, it was really exciting just to get to work a little closer with Mr. Knoll and hear about, how he got into the industry. So I'd recommend anyone who's able to watch the Light and Magic documentary to check that out, because it's pretty fascinating. Just talking about the early days of visual effects and how it came to be.
Yeah. So, all right. I understand we're running out of time. So I just want to finish off the podcast. I finish every podcast off with this question. If you could leave one piece of advice to the listener, could be about business, visual effects, life, anything you want it to be, what sort of advice would you leave to the listeners?
That's a great question. Let's see if I can keep it down to just one piece of advice or two. I would say I would recommend to stay hungry, to fully invest in whatever it is you're doing now. Like often, and I've had conversations with students that I'm mentoring where they're not sure what they want to do in the future. And for me, that industry didn't exist at the time. Like visual effects certainly didn't look anything like it does now when I started out. But just sort of going for something that I was interested in at the time and fully committing myself to it, but then staying hungry and curious and interested and being willing to learn. So for me, it was, taking in those art books and learning about cinematography and design, then positioned me for when the next thing came, I was able to then take advantage of that. So I would say don't worry too much about sort of the future and what the future will hold, but really sort of be very present and to, sort of put your energy into sort of doing the best that you can at where you're currently at. And I think the future is very exciting, when we think about where visual effects currently is and computer graphics, but then we think about some of the new things that are coming out. So there's like Chat GPT. There's a lot of sort of AI-based things mid-journey, right? Where you're going to be able to have these tools produce images for you. That who knows where the convergence of these things will, where they will be 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Absolutely.
So it's hard to really sort of plan or know, okay, this job is going to exist. But really focusing on the fundamentals and just sort of rounding yourself out as much as possible with the tools that you can now. And as I say, being hungry, being curious will sort of position you for what's next.
Yeah. I have a funny story about Chat GPT. Really quick. I am part of a networking group, and we were supposed to come up with like a Christmas jingle about our business. And I have a product development company as well. And I completely forgot and went to the meeting and had no jingle. So I went into Chat GPT, and I have a lot of 3D printers. So I said, Christmas jingle about 3D printers. And it generated this awesome jingle, and I used it. And it was, like out of nowhere.
That's amazing.
This AI was able to create that. And thank you, Chat GPT.
Yes. Yeah. And I've seen some great examples on Twitter where people have they will sort of say what the prompt is or what the use case is, and then the end result. It's pretty amazing. And this is just sort of, it's pretty early days, We'll think about sort of how it will be able to automate and simplify things for us a couple of years from now. It's pretty exciting.
Absolutely. But thank you very much for taking time out of your day to talk. I've had a great time talking to you and hearing your life story and your career. It's been amazing.
My pleasure, Max. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely. And thank you guys for listening to the Knowledge is Power podcast. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. And if you want to get episodes weeks before they're posted on widely available platforms, subscribe on Patreon for as little as $3 a month and get early access to episodes. So thank you again, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast. Thank you, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.